Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first concert of 2025. I am Gary Levinson. I am the Artistic Director of the Chamber Music Society of Fort Worth, and I'm really thrilled to welcome all of you to this very special concert, the first one of 25, but of course we're in the middle of our season, and we've had some banner concerts, as you well know. It's a very interesting program, and this afternoon I'm very proud and happy to have Till Meyn, our good friend, come and help us with the pre-concert talk. Please welcome him. It's so much fun to explain carrying the torch in this program, because if you look at your programs, some people might think the first half is all about alphabetical order and all composers I can think of named that starts with the letter M, but that's not the reason they're there. What's interesting about the first half, and really about the entire concert, is that we have compositions not only from master composers, but the ability to go across periods. So like if you think about the classical period of Mozart and then his late works, of which the Kecklerstadt Trio is one, he would move as a composer and also as a performer into different exciting sonic profiles, as well as using different kind of even rhythm and harmonic progressions. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk to Till about, and for you to really participate in this, I mean, one of the great things to have a composer right here on our stage is to speak about something that is a transcription. Now, generally a transcription would be a piece of music that a composer would write for various instruments, and then someone like myself would say, hey, it's really great on the violin instead of clarinet, as the Kecklerstadt Trio was actually intended to be. But in this case, this was not at all the case, right? I mean, this is Mozart saying, well, wait a minute, why don't we try this with a different set of instrumentation? Can you tell us about that from a compositional standpoint of view?
Yes, and thank you, Gary. It's great to be here. Happy New Year, everybody. I think one of the interesting things about this piece, as you mentioned, is that it has various optional instruments. But as I understand it, it was originally envisioned for clarinet. And then the publisher said, well, the clarinet, maybe I might be making this up a little bit.
I don't believe it.
But the publisher may have said, well, the clarinet isn't really that established of an instrument yet. And you may know that the oboe has been around for a long time, the flute for a long time, but the clarinet was more of a folksy instrument. And Haydn himself didn't use it until 1791, right? But Mozart was inclined to use the clarinet, and I think his publisher said, well, let's try this for violin, because it's going to sell better, probably.
That's an excellent point. And once again, why are we talking about the clarinet? Let's look at that slide there. You have various kinds of clarinets, and then our board president, the clarinet player, should be able to figure all of them out, right, Michael? And the basset horn is the second one from the top. And it's a very interesting way of producing the sound, because you see that bend where the air flows through. And to my ear, it's more of a woody sound, and I think that's, when you're talking about composers, they have a certain sound in their mind, I'm sure you would agree. And Anton Stadler, which we'll talk about in a moment, was someone who was a great virtuoso, and Mozart very much admired him. So he not only wrote this piece of music, he also wrote the great clarinet concerto and the clarinet quintet in the chamber music field. So I think we got to talk about the sound of the basset horn, and then in the 20th and 21st century, the sound of the clarinet.
And I agree. I think the basset clarinet has a reedier sound, but also, as I understand it, it's a larger instrument. So if you take the modern clarinet in A, it goes down to a sounding D, but the basset clarinet goes down to the A.
Right. Exactly, and also I think just from a physical standpoint of view, you can see it's a longer instrument, there's more air, there's probably more pressure in order to produce the sound, and one of the many things that are exciting about the evolution of instruments, we could talk about this for hours, is that you can actually have a lot of the same effects, if you will, with less physical labor. So you can play longer, you can practice more. One of the reasons that music became longer in the 19th century is the evolution of these instruments allowed composers to compose like Gerlieder, an hour and a half piece of music, which in Mozart's time would be unthinkable. They would get too tired and they would have to be replaced by other musicians.
Yeah, and I mean, we're talking about a woodwind instrument here now, but of course, with you playing violin, Yeah, you could again talk for hours about how
Well, you know me, I never get tired. That's why.
right, yes, exactly. I mean, the bow has changed for the string instrument over the centuries. The instrument itself has changed so much, and there's much more pressure you can put on it. Various varying dynamic levels have changed a lot.
Just the evolution of halls, and I think the way our society became. We wanted to be able to play both chamber music like we have in a concert hall like this, and also be able to project to an auditorium of 3,000 people, which Mozart could never even imagine.
Right.
So let's listen to some music. Why don't we? In the very opening Andante, well, first of all, let's talk about key centers really quick. E flat major is just such an incredible key. I always associate it with Beethoven, but for Mozart as well, it's a key of happiness and sunshine. Anything you might want to add about E flat major?
I mean, as a composer, I have to admit that E flat is my favorite. And it just for some reason, when I go to the piano and I sit down and play something in E flat, it sounds richer. And I do believe that in the classical era as well, that had that rich, almost like a royal sound.
Yes.
So yeah, it's a whole lot different. If you're playing C major, no sharps or flats, you're playing E major, and now you've got a lot of sharps. It's just a whole different sound.
And the beauty of it is that, unlike, let's say, Brahms, who started with some dark music, this is sunshine from the beginning to the end. This is a piece of music that really welcomes in the new year, which is one of the reasons we wanted to have it at this January 4th concert. Let's listen to number 1, John, please. So I should have warned you that you're going to be listening to examples in the more common clarinet version of the Kegelstadt trio, because I just kind of wanted to hear the sound that you're not going to get at the concert.
Right. And something else I wanted to point out is this little figure that we call a turn figure is going to be the main motive, really, of this movement, and it appears various places around the piece.
That's a great point, actually. For those of you who like to collect and read music, he actually writes it out, Mozart. In the Baroque, for example, you would never write down a Nachschlag. You would just basically do a turn around the main note, and you figure out how you want to do it.
Yeah, you would write a little sideways S, and the performers know what to do. But here he puts in these 30-second notes, and it's the upper and the lower neighbor to the main note that you have. So everywhere throughout this movement, you'll hear that little turn figure.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because even though the last movement is in fact a rondo, jumping ahead, this appears in the not rondo movement all of the time. So it's a very classical form. Yeah. Let's definitely move on now to the slow movement. And it's in a dominant key, it's B flat major. And it's very interesting because in Mozart's time, a lot of the trios, certainly the regular piano, cello, violin version, were really piano concertos with the strings accompanying. And here, the clarinet, or the violin in this case, get a lot of attention, probably because Mozart adored Stadler, and he was really in love with his musicianship as well as his virtuosity. So let's listen to the slow movement, the Andante.
This, by the way, I think it's still the first movement, but it's the second theme.
Second theme.
Yeah.
Correct. Sorry.
And you can hear how that theme is related to the first theme, and even that little turn figure found its way back again. But as is usual for a sonata form first movement, the two themes are usually different from one another, so they can be set apart throughout the piece.
Exactly. Just to explain this slide a little bit, in the Baroque, and really even in the Renaissance, the string family was multiple instruments. In other words, if you think of today, the symphony orchestra, we have the violins, the violas, the cellos, and the basses. But in the viol family alone, and those of you who are museum hounds like me, the Met probably has 30 different viols, just like they have a bunch of keyboard instruments.
VIOL, not VILE.
Yes, exactly. And so the viola has a C string, much like the cello, and it doesn't have an E string. So that's kind of the friendship part of the slide. Let's go on to the minuetto, which is a slower and a very regal minuet. Again, it has no weight, I would say. It's a very beautiful movement that has a lot of schwung, but it doesn't really have any sort of gravitas, and it's something that's really fun to play. And I would say that certainly in the violin version, it's really not meant to be danced to. Perhaps in the clarinet version, you could see that as a kind of a divertimento at a party, but I'm pretty sure this was meant to be sit down and listen to.
It's pretty stately.
Very, yeah. Number 3, please. So it's as stately as Till mentioned, a stately minuet, but it's also wonderful because there's an answer always from the piano to this way of the strings in our incarnation just kind of introduce it, and then the piano gently answers it. Right. In the trio, so keep in mind that we still have minuet and trio. We don't have the scherzo coming up in Beethoven's time. The trio is a giant, I would say, a very virtuosic solo for the viola. And it's very interesting because Mozart, of course, adored viola, and there's a lot of, I would say, arguments whether he liked the viola better than the clarinet, because he wrote equally. I mean, the Sinfonia Concertante was written for viola, and apparently he learned to play viola in his father's quartet, and he certainly had in the symphonies a lot of viola solos. So in this case, he's really able to showcase the viola. And the piano and the violin, in our case, is actually just accompanying.
And the viola and the clarinet have essentially the same range. Of course, they sound a lot different, but they're both very warm instruments. And so actually, even today, if you want to arrange something for clarinet that was written for viola, it's not difficult to do.
Yeah, one of the reasons I really wanted to do our version with the violin is because the viola goes in that timbre between cello and violin. So you have the tenor timbre, and then you have the alto timbre. So if you just think of a chorus, you're really covering 2 sets of voices with the viola. So let's listen to the trio, number 4, please.
Should we talk about that little 3-note figure?
I was just going to introduce that.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Let's talk about motifs.
Motifs, yeah, something that we actually, I think it comes up quite often when we talk here about how a composer puts together a composition. And one of those features that you'll find in this movement is that the little 4 notes, it's actually 3 pitches, but one of them is repeated. And so you heard this. So it's like a little motto or motif that is the little building block that comes back throughout the piece. Well, many other composers have done this sort of thing.
Most famous being?
You told me the other day you like the Shostakovich version of this.
Yeah, but I first started talking about Bach.
Well, Bach was the first.
Was the father, and in a way, but father of us all. But I mean, really, when he would spell a B-A-C-H, and this happens both in the secular music and the sacred music, you can really tell in fugue subjects and so on.
So that's B-A-C-H in notes.
And Shostakovich would
and
be?
The Shostakovich. And remember, we started with. So it's very similar. 4 notes, all chromatically close to each other.
Yeah, and I would say that living composers certainly spell out their names or certain initials very often. I mean, it's something that's sort of like a keystone signature in a building, that's really kind of cool. All right, so let's move on to the last movement here, the rondo. It's a 7-part rondo. And he, interestingly enough, he spells it in the French with the AUX. And I wonder why, because apparently Mozart spoke excellent English, and of course, there's native German. But maybe there's an elegance to this rondo that is not in any way aggressive. It's a charming rondo, and considering the fact that it ends this piece, it's not meant to be bombastic in any way. So let's listen to track number 5, please. This is the one time the piano really gets to show off. Actually, all of us do. But it feels to me like whenever I play this piece, Mozart makes us wait for it.
Yeah.
Because we expect him to have the big virtuoso piano parts all the time, and he doesn't do that for us.
Yeah. I think that's also the mark of a great composer and great pianist, is that he wants everybody to get the tune, everyone get a chance to show off.
Yeah, and certainly he was the maverick in this because, as we spoke about before, the custom of the time would be, hey, let me show off the pianist. And Mozart, of course, was in some ways pianist first, because though he obviously composed beautifully and he got a lot of gigs, if you will, being hired as a composer, he would, perform as a pianist equally as and probably more than, because it takes time to write things down, obviously, you know. Whereas the story goes that many of his piano concertos, he never wrote down the solo part. In fact, he barely copied out the orchestra parts.
Yeah.
And the morning before, they would still be trying to put music in, and he would go out there and put the full crowd and improvise the concerto, trying to remember what key centers he wrote down for the orchestra.
And a good full circle moment for this piece. This is called the Kegelstadt Trio. So the idea, we don't know if it's true or not, but the idea is he was playing a game of Kegel or Skittles while composing this piece. So he's multitasking.
This is a fun piece of music you'll enjoy. Okay, let's move on to Boguslav Martinu. Maybe not as familiar to chamber music audiences, but really unfairly so, because his musical language is something that we'll talk about this afternoon. He was native to what is now the Czech Republic, but he also lived in Paris, and rather at the end of what we sometimes think of as a golden period of Parisian music. You know, you think about Ravel, and you think about, Stravinsky living in Paris, Nadia Boulanger,
Yeah,
all of that
Millot,
time.
Poulenc.
Exactly, yeah. So turn of the century. So this is quite a little bit later, and this piece is from 1947. So you remember the war was just over in 45. And there's something about this duo that is not only close to my heart, I'm about to tell you why, but there's a harmonic language about this and a rhythmic language that's quite unique. So let's talk about the rhythmic language first. Especially in the slow movement, you're going to see a lot of the meters change, and yet it's not about how they're put together. So for example, if you have something in 5/8, it's generally 2 + 3 or 3 + 2. Well, in this case, each eighth note will have equal weight. So you have yam, bam, da, bam, bam, dam, dam. Things like that. So you want to listen for something like that. And then, of course, there's some dissonances, obviously 20th century composer, but there's so much folk music here, and there's so much beauty to the way he makes the violin viola duo sound like a string orchestra. It's really a spectacular piece of music. So I have a very quick story to tell you, because one of my chamber music teachers at the Juilliard School was a woman named Lillian Fuchs. Well, her brother was a distinguished concertmaster in the 40s of the Cleveland Orchestra. And Martinu actually was commissioned by those two to write this duo, and she taught it to me. So I kind of got it from the horse's mouth.
Yeah, you've got the connection there, yeah.
Yeah, and she was a tiny little lady with a gigantic viola and played everything by memory, including her piano playing was unbelievably good. And so she kind of made me fall in love with this piece, and I'm really proud that we get the chance to play it here.
I just don't know Martinu's music that well, but I will say in preparing for us talking, I started to listen more, and I fell in love with it.
Yeah.
It's complex, and yet it really ties into the folk tradition that he's from.
It's kind of crazy because we think of Dvorak, of course, and we think of Suk, and we think of Smetana as the great Bohemian composers, and they are great. But there's something about the language of Martinu that also pays homage to these composers and still is his own sound and his own signature. You'll hear from the examples even that there's very special. So let's listen to number one. This first movement, there's a lot of flurrying, there's a lot of imitative counterpoint, and then there's just a lot of gestures that get exchanged between the two instruments. So number 6, please. So you can see that it's a virtuosic thing, but it's also a fun thing. I think a lot of these gestures, they're not meant to sound difficult. They're supposed to be whimsical, and they're a lot. Learning this piece for the first time, I remember thinking that just from a rhythmic standpoint of view, man, it was difficult.
Well, sure.
But it flows.
Yeah.
And it's notated really well.
Notated well. You would know you're playing. These little tunes that keep being tossed around from one instrument to another. That's of course very playful. And what always interests me as a composer is how music can sound. Let's just say it sounds good to us, but what does that mean? And often it means that we can understand the tonality at the moment that we're listening. And in a piece like this, which is modern, the tonality is shifting very quickly, and yet it doesn't sound too dissonant to us. At least I don't think so.
I agree completely. I mean, it's still firmly in the Bohemian area, in the language of Bohemia, and yet nobody would confuse it with Dvorak or Smetana. Right. So the slow movement, it's quite beautiful, and it's really interesting to me because it has a lot of trills, which is basically, how to explain a trill? It's a quick two-note pattern, and you'll hear it, but usually that's meant as an embellishment. In this case, he uses it as a tonal vehicle. It's meant to tell a story, and it's rather a fluttering sort of a gesture. But as I said, it's not really used that way with most composers. He does use it. Debussy will sometimes as well, and of course, he knew the music of Debussy very well. Yeah. So let's listen to number 2, the Poco Andante, which is a little bit reminiscent also of Bartók. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in that little clip there.
Another thing I should really mention, I mean, this is all concertina with the mute, but it's very interesting because he doesn't mark a lot in terms of where on the fingerboard you play. And the reason I mention that is if you're closer to the fingerboard, if you will, you get a much more diffused sound in addition to the mute. In this case, because of the way the trills are, the tessitura is really wide apart. It's actually really hard to hear the upper note because of the open A for the violin. And then, of course, the viola lays the carpet for that.
And I think some of the overtones, the harmonics, kind of, you kind of hear them up above. It's like almost a squeaky sound, but this is intentional.
Just as a sidebar, I had to record this piece. I wanted to record this piece in 2007. And it's a complicated thing to record because the mics are unforgiving. And the engineer says, can't hear the A. Can you try that again? Can't hear it. He's like, well, I am playing it. Can't hear it. So this afternoon, not to worry. So the Allegro is actually a real brash, I would say, virtuoso piece for both instruments. It has more counterpoint than the first two pieces. It does. But I don't think it's actually meant to be thick. It's meant to be playful.
Yeah, this movement, I don't know if you all will agree with me when you hear the clip, but it reminds me to a certain degree of Bach, because Bach was the master, you could say, of taking this small little motif, like we've talked about earlier, and just spinning it over and over into something new, an ever-changing little area of tonality that keeps moving. And I believe that's the way I would characterize this next clip as well, only in a more modern style.
Absolutely. Let's listen to number 8. This is the Allegro and the finale of the Martinu Madrigals. So it's really a lot of fun to play, and I think you'll really enjoy listening to it. It's one of the great masterpieces of the 20th century, and certainly one of the great duets for violin and viola. Let's quickly move on to Schumann. Cannot speak about Schumann without talking about some of his issues, if you will, and mental illness, because he did have some problems, medical and mental, that today would be solved very easily with medication. But in those days, a lot of people really thought he should be institutionalized. In fact, he was. And this masterpiece of a piano quartet also is kind of remarkable because there were very few piano quartets. Mozart, of course, began the whole thing. And then Brahms, after him, wrote some incredible piano quartets. But that's not the kind of musical group that was very common. And so this is dedicated, actually, to Count Verbitsky, who was a Russian cellist and impresario. And you'll see that there's some incredible cello solos here. One loves to talk about Schumann playing the cello. I don't know how well he played the cello. I know that our cellist this afternoon plays rings around most cellists, so you'll really enjoy his work. And let's look at the way Schumann, worked the opening of this, because it's a slow introduction, really sets the mood, and it doesn't seem to really give you what's about to come, which is a contrast. Let's listen to track number 9, please.
So even though the mood for this introduction is slow and it's somber, it's setting us up for the first theme, which actually is basically the same notes, but much sped up.
For sure. And actually, our next example, we should talk about this instrument, which Schumann never knew, in the 88 keys. And maybe you might want to talk about Schumann's piano a little bit.
Yeah, so it's something we might not think about very often. When we see a piano, we think piano. Everybody's had a piano. It's been around for centuries. Well, not really. Keyboard instruments have changed a lot over the decades and centuries. And so, for instance, in Beethoven's time, he would have been playing, at least at the beginning, on an instrument that had closer to 5 octaves or maybe 5.5 octaves, whereas the piano you see here, the modern piano, has over 7 octaves. And it makes a big difference for a composer when you have that much room to play with the low register and the high register. So Beethoven, as Beethoven got into his older years, later years, he got more into the 6-octave piano. And then with Schumann, who came a generation after that, generation or two after that, then we get into the 6.5-octave piano, so we're getting closer.
Exactly. And so if you look at the size of the keyboard in the slide, it's significantly smaller and shorter than the piano in front of you. Now, our next, the exposition, the main theme, is very interesting because it begins on beat 2, so the actual beat, the meter, is shifted, but because of beat 1 is silent, at times people can't even really understand where is the thing going. Let's listen to number 10, please, the main theme of the exposition. So charming, and still you can't quite tell where the beat is until you have the ostinato in the piano in the left hand.
And that's what Brahms is going to pick up on.
Absolutely.
As a next generation, this idea of fooling the listener, where is the beat? I think that's the beauty, a lot of the beauty in their music is that.
The toe tappers among us are going to be very frustrated. So the next scherzo is going to be really a lot of fun because it's quite Mendelssohnian in character. In some ways, when you first learn this, if you're a string player, you think of Schumann's scherzo from the Second Symphony, which is in every audition excerpt, and every violinist hates it. I can assure you this is much more fun to listen to, and it doesn't have nearly the, let's call it problematic things that the Schumann scherzo of the Second Symphony has. So let's listen to number 11, please.
Schumann does in this movement, in this clip, the same basic thing he just did in the previous movement. You can tap your toe, but you don't know where the strongest beat is for quite a while.
Starts with a pickup.
Yeah.
So in fact, speaking of the rhythm, now the trio coming up in our next example, it has a 2-to-1 rhythmic relationship. So what you're looking at is something that's twice as slow. It doesn't feel slow because he marks it differently. So let's listen to number 12, please. So when he marks the actual score in quarter notes, it even looks a little bit slower to us, but we make it flow. And that's one of the great contrasts between scherzos and trios. Yeah.
I also find the form of this movement to be really interesting because what we're used to with a scherzo or with a minuet for that matter is a three-part form where you have scherzo, trio, and then the scherzo is repeated. But he actually has two trios in this piece. And we're not going to play you the excerpt for the second one, but it ends up being a 5-part rondo, which means that the scherzo keeps coming back in between as well.
We should look at possibly everyone's favorite part, which is the next movement. And it basically every instrument, all of the instruments get a chance to shine. Let's listen to number 13, please. Yeah, it needs no explanation.
Yeah.
The finale is most famous for a fugal interchange, and really a full-fledged fugue, because both Schumanns, you can see Clara over there as well, studied Bach at a time when it kind of began to be interesting. Mendelssohn was into it, but I mean, since Bach's death, there was a period where everybody thought he was very old-fashioned and not meant to be performed. So maybe we can talk about what a fugue is.
Sure, yeah. So as Gary was just saying, Bach's music was taught to composition students, but it became much more a part of their education once Mendelssohn was on the scene and started performing more of Bach's works. So as far as a fugue goes, this is one of those contrapuntal genres that Bach didn't invent, but one may say he perfected it. And what we'll hear in this excerpt, in fact the next two excerpts, is that you hear a tune, and then that tune is picked up by another instrument directly afterwards, and then another instrument picks it up after that. And so the form of that movement is mostly dependent on this little melody that keeps coming back.
And most importantly, we should listen to where it starts, because you're going to think it starts on beat 1, but it actually doesn't. Let's hear number 14, please. Yeah, so I get all the time people say, well, you know, what's with the fugues, you know, all of this counterpoint, it's basically the same thing over and over, like a canon. Why do you guys even get into that kind of thing? And as you can hear, it's pretty exciting when each instrument comes in with its own tonal center and the certain build-up of all four instruments finally playing together.
There's so much beautiful complexity to a fugue like this. Also considering that, and then we'll hear this in the next clip, there are actually two parts to the melody. There's bum, bum, bum. It's like the little motto in the beginning. And then he goes da 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 da. So all the faster notes become one theme or one fugue subject. But then the next fugue subject uses those three slower notes.
So he develops every cell of the subject.
Yep.
Very exciting. Let's listen to the last example, which is more of the fugal interchange, but actually put some of it on its head. This is number 15, please. 14. 15. It is 15.
Yeah. So the other technique he's using here is something called stretto. So he has broken up the theme into these two parts. One of them is the slow three-note little motto, and now he's almost having the motto interrupt another instrument. So everything is compressed, and it creates a lot more tension.
Also, the dual stroke is used to make a crescendo more obvious, because you have to remember shorter fingerboards, pretty much a different bow. None of these instruments that you're about to hear on stage today would have been really familiar with Schumann, even though the great Cremonese masters were there, but they were not set up the way our instruments are set up. So I think you're going to really enjoy this incredible Schumann quartet. We're really excited to see you here. Once again, Happy New Year, and in about 15 minutes, we begin the concert. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.